Hello guys, welcome to another video of Kubernetes. In this video, we are going to understand how we can create the Kubernetes manifest file to create the Kubernetes pod. Okay, we will also see how we can use kubectl commands to create the Kubernetes pods, and I will explain you how you can basically create one Kubernetes manifest file from scratch for a pod. Okay, so let's begin the video. Before going to create the YAML and Kubernetes manifest file, let's just understand the basic. We'll be covering just the brief introduction about Kubernetes pods, and we'll see the YAML as well, like what will be the content of our YAML file in the Kubernetes manifest file. Okay, we'll see step by step how to create the pods and how we can create the YAML as well. Okay. We'll see some of the best practices as well while creating the manifest file. Let's go ahead. So what is Kubernetes pod? This is just the smallest deployable unit in Kubernetes. E- Even anytime if you are deploying containers in your Kubernetes cluster, your containers will be placed inside a unit called pods. You cannot deploy any container in your cluster without creating the pod. So first, when you deploy the containers, you will have to, or Kubernetes will create the pods and it will place your container inside that pod. So pod is a smallest unit which you can create in Kubernetes. Okay, one pod can run multiple containers. You can even create 3, 4, 5 containers in a pod, but generally in most of the cases people use or people create only one container in a pod for high availability and better maintenance. Okay, so generally in production environment or in any organization, people follow one pod into one container. Now let's see why we need to use manifest file. You can use the command line approach as well to create the any resources or create anything in the Kubernetes cluster with kubectl commands. But that is imperative approach. We call that as imperative approach. And there you will have to use the commands and you will have to remember the commands to make the changes. Or you can just run or you can create only one resource at a time using the command line with that kubectl commands. Okay, but if you are working in a DevOps environment or production environment or as a team, generally we should use the declarative approach. We should write the Kubernetes manifest file to create the Kubernetes resources. Okay, so for declarative approach, generally we use the manifest file. Okay, so for now we will be covering the Kubernetes manifest file. In upcoming future videos, we'll be using different type of charts as well. Like we can create Helm charts to deploy the resources in Kubernetes. So we'll be covering those things as well. But for this lecture, I will be discussing about the manifest files. Okay, it's very easy to manage the manifest file that are of YAML. These are reusable and version controllable. You can create the modules or you can create the files and you can reuse them. You can call the same files and supply the parameters, and also you can keep your Kubernetes manifest file inside the version control, uh, like GitHub, Azure repositories, Bitbucket, or any other version control. Okay, so that you will be able to take it from there, use that manifest file to deploy either with your local machine or with the CI/CD pipelines. Okay, so we can just keep our manifest file in the version control and use our CI/CD pipelines to basically automate creating the Kubernetes resources. Okay, the next one is scalability. We can easily scale with YAML changes. So whenever you have to scale up your resources or scale down your resources, we can just make a minor change in our YAML pipeline and we can redeploy the Kubernetes manifest file so that our resource or our Kubernetes cluster will be scaled. Okay, so it's very easy. If you want to scale the Kubernetes cluster with command line kubectl commands, it's quite not difficult, but you can say you will have to remember the commands that are, I mean, all the list of commands are very long. So using Kubernetes manifest, it's very easy to just change your YAML. So suppose you have replica set of 5 and you want to change it to 9. You can just open your YAML file, keep the replica set count as 9 and just redeploy it. It will scale your Kubernetes cluster. Now let's break down the Kubernetes manifest YAML file. So when you are writing the YAML file for Kubernetes manifest, generally you will have four components inside your YAML. First one will be the API version, second will be the kind, third will be the metadata, and fourth will be the spec. So these four are the important, you can say, components of your YAML file. API version, you will have to write the API version which you might be using inside your Kubernetes cluster or Kubernetes manifest. So it depends on the resource which you are creating. So suppose you are creating the pod, you will just write the API version as v1. If you are creating the replica set, you can write the API version app slash v1. So you will generally get the API version, what API version you should use for creating which resources. You will get this information in Kubernetes official documentation. So whenever you need to understand what is API version and what API version I should use for creating this particular resource, you can go and check in the Kubernetes official documentation. You will be getting the API version here. Okay. The next component is the kind. Kind is nothing but the resource which you want to create. So suppose you want to create the pod, you will have to write the pod in kind. If you want to create the replica set, you will just write the replica set. If you want to create the service, if you want to create the deployment, you will have to write the same inside the kind. Okay, so that resource will be created when you will be running the Kubernetes manifest YAML file. Okay, this metadata is nothing but the information about your resources or this Kubernetes resources which will be created in the Kubernetes cluster. So suppose if you are creating the pod, then you can just write some metadata or write the information about your pod so that you can even use this metadata later inside your Kubernetes. Okay. So if I give you an example, if you are creating the pod, you can just write the name of the pod or you can just write the type or whatever you want to just write. You can just write the details in metadata and later when you need to use this metadata while creating the deployment or replica set in match labels and selectors, you will have to use this metadata in there. Okay, whenever we create the replica set, we generally use this metadata in the selectors so that all the pods with this metadata or match label will be part of that replica set and deployment. So here in case of replica set deployment, this metadata concept will be important. You will have to write the metadata carefully. I will explain this when I will explain the Kubernetes manifest file in few minutes. The next one is spec. So a spec is the most important one. You will have to keep all the resources, whatever you want to create in this spec component. Suppose you want to create the replica set, you will have to write the information about replica set here in the spec. If you are creating the pod, you will have to write the information about your pod inside this spec. So let's now go ahead and understand one basic YAML manifest file to create the pods. This is one example of a manifest file to create the pod. If you just write this YAML and run the apply command in this YAML file, it will create one pod, that is my-pod, inside your Kubernetes cluster. So if you see carefully in this YAML file, you will see the first component is API version, and that is v1. So this is the first component, API version. Whatever manifest file you are writing, will have to specify the API version. So for pods, this is v1. For different resources, they I mean API version might change. Like for replica set or other things, you can use app/v1. Okay, so this information we generally get it from the Kubernetes official documentation. Okay, next one is kind. Which resource, what type of resource you want to create. So in this course, in this video, we are just creating the pod. That's why we have written the kind as pod. Okay, so whenever we create this or run this YAML file, this will create one pod. The next component is metadata, which is which starts from here and ends here. So here in metadata, you can see we have specified the name, that is my-pod, and we have added the labels as well, that is app. This is for app and this is for my app. So this is important, like metadata is important if you are creating the replica set or deployment. So we generally use this metadata, like you can use this name or labels. So we can use this label app or my app. So all the pods with this label app my app will be part of that particular replica set. So this metadata is important when you are creating deployment or replica set. Else, I mean, you can specify any metadata as per your requirement. The next component is spec, which is the important one. Here you specify all the details, like what are the resources you want to create. If you see in spec, we are creating the containers, because in the pod generally we have to supply the container image using which we are creating the pod. So suppose you are creating one pod for your web app like Nginx or web server, you can just write this for the create for the contain for the pods. We'll have to supply the containers. For that, you will have to write the containers. After that, you will have to add the container name, that is my container, and you will have to specify the image. If you are specifying your image in this format, this will go ahead and by default will search in Docker Hub. If this image is not found in Docker Hub, this deployment will fail. If you are using some private repository like Azure Container Registry or somewhere else, you will have to specify the full URL of your container registry. Then only it will go ahead and search your image in that registry. Okay, you should have access, or your agent machine or your local machine should have access of that container registry. Then only it will go ahead and fetch the image. If there are connectivity issues or authentication issues, it will throw you an error. So make sure your agent machine or your local machine is having access to the container registry, or you will have, or if you have the required permission. If not, you can use the Docker Hub. So I just specified image Nginx latest. So this, if I just run this YAML file, this will go ahead and search for this image in the Docker Hub. Okay, if found, it will go ahead and create the pod, else it will fail. So we have a specified name, image, and ports in the container. Okay, so to create the pod, this is just one smallest unit in the Kubernetes. You need containers and images to create the containers. So in one pod, you should have containers, and containers you can create using the image. So if you see in this YAML, I am creating the pod, and in the containers, I am supplying the container name and image as well. So using this image, our container will be created, and this container will be created inside this pod that is named as my pod. We have supplied the ports as well, like what will be the port of this container. You can use this 80 container, there will be IP assigned to this pod. You can use that IP address and colon 80 to access this pod inside your cluster or from your browser using the, if you have created the service, or if you want to just access this pod directly from your kubectl commands or cluster, you can just type this pod IP address colon 80 to access this pod. Okay, so this is the simple YAML file to create one pod inside the Kubernetes cluster. We can use this to create the pods. Let me repeat this again. We'll have API version, kind, metadata, and spec. These are only the four important components of Kubernetes manifest file. Whatever manifest you are writing, that can be replica set, deployment, service, pod, or any other thing, ingress, and any other thing, you will have to write these four components. And inside that, you can write whatever you want. Like if you want to create the replica set, you can specify the replica set details here. Okay, now let's go ahead. Once you have created the Kubernetes manifest file, you can use this command kubectl apply -f. This is nothing but file, and this is the path of your YAML file. If you are in the current directory, you can just simply write the YAML file name, else you can just give the full path here. So you should be using kubectl apply -f and your YAML manifest file. Okay, if you are creating this resource for the first time, you can use kubectl create as well. Kubectl create -f pod.yaml, but I will advise you to use kubectl apply, because for multiple deployments, and or if you are rerunning the pipeline or rerunning the kubectl create command, if resource already exists or deployment already exists, your deployment will be failed, and it will not create the resource, or it will not update the resource. So to update the resource, just use kubectl apply -f and your YAML file. Once everything is created, you can run this command kubectl get pods to validate if your pods are created. And if you need more details or detailed description of your pod, or all the other details like IP address and everything, you can just simply run this kubectl describe pod and name of your pod to get more information about your pod. Okay, so I will show you just another example of how you can write the YAML file. Okay, we'll be writing the pod.yaml. We can apply it with kubectl apply -f pod.yaml, and we can verify the resources created with kubectl get pods. Okay, so this is just another YAML file to create the pod. Just like the previous one, you can see we have used the API version as v1. You can just type it. I will show you the demo in future videos. You can just type it, and you can try to run this command or run this manifest file inside your local Kubernetes cluster, or inside your cloud Kubernetes cluster like AKS or any other. For metadata, we have used example pod app, that is Nginx app, and name we have supplied Nginx container, and image we have given Nginx, and this is the version of Nginx. So this will create this container with this image. We are accessing this pod, or we have provided the container port as 80. Okay, so this will create another pod with example hyphen pod. You can go ahead and try that YAML file. I'll be showing the demo in future videos when we will start the demo. Now, what are the best practices when you are using the YAML files? Okay, so in case of declarative YAML, you should be defining your desired state clearly. You'll have to specify what you want to create. You have to minimize the errors, then only your manifest file will work, else it will not work. It is advisable to always version your manifest file and store in the version control, so that you can just download it from there, or you can use that version control repository to just create the resources or create your Kubernetes resources using CI/CD pipelines or from your local directly. Okay, you can even automate it if you are keeping in version control, and if you are versioning your manifest file. So whenever if you have to roll back, or if you have to deploy the previous version, you can always use your version control to do the same. Okay, use namespaces to isolate the environment. Generally, we can there is a concept of namespaces in Kubernetes. We can use that to isolate the environments. You can use the, or you can create the different environments like dev, test, pre-production, production in the same cluster using the namespaces. Okay, it is best to write your YAML manifest file in modules, so that you can reuse that for later use. So finally, the recap: pods are the basic unit in Kubernetes, and these are the smallest unit. If you are creating it, you will have to supply the containers images and the container names. So this is the smallest unit you can create in the Kubernetes. Manifest files are declarative and easy to version, and easy to store in version control as well. You can just write it and keep inside your repository in the GitHub, Azure repository, or any version control. Okay, so that's it from this video. If you have any questions or anything you need to ask, just write in the comments. Or if you like this video, please like and subscribe my channel. If you have any feedback or suggestions, please let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching.